Tuberneros. Well, as you probably know, the New World Order proclaimed in 1991 by Bush the Elder is stuck in deep doodoo. That was his other famous phrase, and the two terms have, as we see, become synonymous. The doodoo is ripe, which means times are ripe for change. Fundamental, sweeping, transforming changes, of the kind we saw throughout the 20th century that swept the likes of Lenin, Hitler, Mao, or Fidel Castro to power. The pundit class, academia, all the spokesmen of the status quo warn us, the public, repeatedly of these bad precedents, shaking their schoolmasters' fingers at us, warning us not to play with those bad boys. But they, of course, do nothing to pull us out of the swamp of circumstances threatening to drown us. The same class writing the history books and pronouncing judgment are of the same class that did nothing to help the situations of times past, and do nothing now. Partly it's because they profit off the wreck and ruin around them. They're the same people who so blithely led us into the morass. Partly it's because, even when they're not so inhuman as that, the mud doesn't really touch their trousers. They're content to patch up the boat just enough to keep themselves from drowning. And to those of us still sinking out of sight, they just shrug and say, sorry, it's the best we can do. Somebody's got to stay alive and carry on, and better us important persons than you nobodies. So, no wonder the drowning, the despairing, and the desperate turn to Lenin, to Hitler, to Fidel, the responsible leaders, and their second-rank mouthpieces and shills, who spill so much ink damning revolutions and those who lead them, which is but comparable to the blood spilled fighting their useless international wars. These leaders and mouthpieces of today will not lift a finger to prevent the same thing happening all over again, except this one. Well, let me rephrase that. They'll support police pepper spray in Liberty Plaza at the lower levels of policy. At the highest level, they'll cheer on NATO bombing squadrons. They'll hide within their gated communities that keep the swamp people out. But to actually lead people out of the swamp, out of the quicksand and mud, forget that. Can't be done. After all, they led us there to drown in the first place like excess kittens. That's why those seeking change the right way, nonviolently, playing by the system's rules, they get repressed anyway, clubbed and dog-bit and tear-gassed and pepper-sprayed and maced and tasered and shot in the head with beanbags. So what's the point of playing by the system's rules when it's going to violate them and stomp you anyway? They seem determined to prove Lev Trotsky right when he said revolutions happen when there's no other way out. They obviously want the choice narrowed down to this, confident they have all the winning cards of political and economic dominance. So no wonder leadership is left to a Lenin or Hitler or Fidel or Malcolm X. They're not the right people to lead? Well, for all their violence and fanaticism and self-seeking, they were the only ones around with the energy to jump in the swamp and push from behind. They were the engines that pulled their respective nations and peoples out of the historical mud. Let's take the example of Cuba. Regardless of how Marxist Fidel was or was not, Cuba's revolution was originally a middle-class reformist movement, opposing not just the Batista dictatorship, but the grafting crony capitalism that underlay it, against the rising inequality between Cuba's first world, centered in high-rise Havana, and a stagnating rural third world. Why was it left for Fidel to take charge and lead it, to break through the crust of complacency and intimidation? Because the right people, the political leaders, the men of letters, the jurists, the clergy, labor leaders, were too busy gaming the corrupt system for themselves. Of course, Castro got lectured by the finger-wagging, red-baiting establishment, even on the left. How could someone in the post-Stalinist age fall for the shop-worn myth of Bolshevism? Because the post-Stalinists were too busy with their translations of Milovan Djilas and Arthur Koestler and Czeslaw Milosz to care about the real problems of a place like Cuba, regarding U.S. empire and poverty and corruption, and why not? These left intellectuals were part of the same corporate system of dominance feeding off the subject backwardness of a tropical backwater like Cuba. So it was left to Fidel and his 26th of July movement to tackle those problems in his own way, which he did. There was no one else with the drive and energy to put it through. That he went farther with it than liberal Democrats liked is as much their failure as Fidel's ambition. If the right people had cared for freedom and democracy and human rights 1/10 as much before Fidel came to power as they wailed over them afterward, Fidel wouldn't still be El Leader Maximo of the revolutionary process a half-century later. And then there's the classic example of Russia in 1917. You might think that's a well-plowed field, but every time you go over it you scrape up some new artifact. Lenin was held to have overthrown democracy in October-November 1917, but the truth is that the Russian Provisional Government was a self-appointed rump committee from the disbanded Imperial Duma. The Soviet was the only popularly elected democratic body in existence. The provisional government's so-called Democrats continuously postponed holding national elections because democracy is too serious, too precious, to place in the dirty hands of the childlike dark people. Better to keep it on the shelf where it won't get broken. And so it was thrown out with all the useless bric-a-brac of the old order. If the Russian Liberal Democrats of 1917 weren't such inveterate snobs, clinging to the Western Allies in a losing war, refusing to meet their own people even halfway, Lenin would never have had his opening to jump in and take it all from them. And while Western scholars will spare no amount of ink lambasting London for closing down the Constituent Assembly in 1918, the fact remains that it was Lenin who finally held the elections promised in March by the good guy Democrats, which means apparently he didn't take democracy seriously enough. So, those being left behind in the quicksand have a choice: to feel themselves sink deeper and ever deeper, inch by inch, into the deepening doodoo, or grab onto the line thrown them, no matter how unworthy the rescuer. Which to do? The pundits of academia and the media tell us from their high and dry perches that we should refuse such a lifeline and drown with dignity. Is it any wonder that they get hung by that lifeline as soon as the drowning pull themselves free and dry? When a Lenin or a Hitler or a Fidel come to power, rest assured it's not so much the fault of deluded masses as of stand-pat leaders who hate those masses they've led into ruin, who will not help anyone in the mess of their own creation, who will accept no responsibility and try to pretend the suffering of war and the anguish of poverty they've caused do not exist. And if they do acknowledge these, it's to blame the sufferers. It's those people's own fault for having a victim mentality, not the fault of the thief on Wall Street, the con artist on K Street, or the rapist on Pennsylvania Avenue. Castro, as the last of the old-time revolutionaries, is about to pass from the scene. We're told that history has bypassed him and what he stood for. But where has that bypass led? To some new off-ramp valley of love and delight? I don't think so. Francis Fukuyama's end of history has come to a dead end in the swamp because the state highway departments run out of funds and us common folk can't afford the private super tollway zooming over our heads. So, to recapitulate, anytime a serious bout of reform threatens the status quo of the lecturing schoolmasters, rest assured they will do nothing to help those struggling to overcome injustice, poverty, or violence, except to wag their fingers and tell us that's not the way, no matter what we do, while the right way, playing by the rules of their game, always turns out to be the one that causes them the least discomfort. And again, any leader that does follow the path of nonviolent, high-principled resistance, from Jesus to Gandhi or Martin Luther King, gets bumped off. Where are the finger-wagging pundits then? Like Christopher Hitchens, they sigh into their chablis and write another essay on the futility of it all. The real solution might be just to form a human chain and pull ourselves out of the mud, owing nothing to no one. And when we get to dry land, we turn our backs on the pundits, the politicians, the economists, the academics, and the generals, and refuse to listen to anything they have to say. Knock on the YouTube phone. Who is it this time? Hello? Malcolm X? The Nation of Islam leader? Hey, don't you know you were a dangerous cult leader out to destroy our free way of life? Just ask Michelle Bachmann. So what's up these days in Allah's nation of love and delight? That people need to remember what you said years ago, that you can't sit at a table and watch another man eat and call yourself a diner. A more telling critique of supply-sideism and state-owned economy was never uttered. Right now they're not hungry enough to believe you, but they're getting there.